Ask any member of Congress, and they'll all tell you that the government has to tax to get money to spend. And what it doesn't get in taxes, it has to borrow from the likes of China and leave debt to our grandchildren. Let me repeat. Ask any member of Congress, and they'll all tell you the government has to tax to get money to spend. And what it doesn't get in taxes, it has to borrow from China and leave debt to our grandchildren.
At what point do we run out of money?
Well, we're out of money now. We're operating in deep deficits.
First, let's look what happens when you pay your taxes with cash. They take your old $20 bills, they give you a receipt, and then they throw your hard-earned dollars in the shredder. They even sell bags of shredded money on the internet. Look it up if you don't believe me. So how does taking your cash away from you, and then shredding it, pay for anything? If they need your dollars to be able to spend, like they all say they do, why are they throwing them away? The same thing happens when the government borrows. If you buy government bonds with actual cash, you give them the cash, they give you the bonds, and then they send that cash to the shredder. So what's going on? Why are they borrowing your dollars, paying you interest, and then throwing it away? What sense does that make? Who would do that? If someone buys something from you and pays you in cash, do you throw that cash away? Of course not. Clearly, the government is not anything like a business or household when it comes to finance. Clearly, the government does not need your dollars to be able to spend. And clearly, something else is going on here. How does the government spend? Let's look what happens when you get a social security payment. With online banking, you can see it happen. Let's say you already have $3,000 in your account. When the $1,000 payment hits your account, your balance changes to $4,000. Watch it again. You now have $4,000 in your account. So what did the government do? Did they hammer a gold coin or dump a pile of money into your computer? No, they just changed the 3 to a 4. That's how it works. As the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, told us,
is that tax money that the Fed is spending?
It's not tax money. The banks have accounts with the Fed much the same way that you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account that they have with the Fed.
Today, that's where all dollars come from. Numbers are simply marked up by computers. So how can the government ever run out of dollars?
At what point do we run out of money?
Well, we're out of money now. We're operating in deep deficit.
More precisely, what happens is that your bank has an account at the Fed, just like you have an account at your bank. And when a payment is made, or a check is deposited, the Fed simply changes the number in your bank's account, and your bank changes the numbers in your account. And what about taxing? When you pay your taxes with a check, for example, all the government does is change the number in your checking account to a smaller number. So if you have $4,000 in your checking account, and then write a check to the government for $1,000, the 4 in your account gets changed to a 3. The government doesn't actually get anything. They just change your number to a lower number. They change numbers up and down all day, and the difference between the spending and the taxing is accounted for as a deficit or surplus only after it's happened. The point here is, the person at the Treasury making the payments by changing numbers up doesn't get anything from the taxman who's changing numbers down. In other words, you know the government doesn't need to collect taxes to be able to spend when the guy making the payments doesn't even have the phone number or the email of the guy doing the taxing. We know the government doesn't need money to spend, so why does it tax? Governments exist to provide public services like the military, healthcare, and transportation networks, and this means the government has to provision itself by transferring goods and services from private to public domain. Today, this is done with a monetary system. It works like this. It begins with a tax levied by the government, payable only in its own currency, such as the dollar. Think of a property tax, for example, where everyone with a house has to pay a tax or lose their property. This creates sellers of goods and services seeking dollars in exchange. Now the people, who the tax caused to be unemployed, can be hired by the government and paid with otherwise worthless dollars. For a historical example, let's look at what happened in the 1800s during Britain's colonization of Africa. In Ghana, Britain wanted to grow coffee. However, the local population had no desire to work for the British government. So the British imposed the hut tax, a tax on everyone's house, payable only with British script, and if the tax wasn't paid, the British burned their houses down. The tax immediately caused what we call unemployment, people looking for paid work. And the British then hired them to work in the coffee fields.
Since the British desired only a portion of the village to be working on a coffee plantation, the wage that the British paid was more than enough to pay the tax. First, the British would pay the wage. Then, the people would pay some of it back in taxes, and the rest they had was savings that could be used to buy things from other people.
Lessons from Ghana. Lesson 1. The British had to spend their script before collecting taxes. Where else could it come from? It was obvious to all that the British paid their workers first, and then collected taxes. The same is true in the US today. All the dollars that can be used to pay federal taxes come from lending and spending from the federal government and its agents. And close examination of government accounts, in fact, confirms the US government spends first, and then is paid taxes or borrows the dollars it already spent. Lesson 2. The British always spent more script than they collected in taxes. In other words, they were always operating with a deficit. This meant that people were looking for more script than they needed to simply pay the tax, which created a supply of script held by the public that hadn't yet been used to pay taxes. And the extra script that the British spent added to the money supply and savings of the economy. We can see the same thing happening in the US today.
Let's assume that the government pays you $4,000.
Tax dollars are subtracted out of your account, leaving you with
$3,000. Those after-tax dollars that remain in people's accounts
are collectively known as the public debt, or the net savings in the economy. Lesson 3. The value of the script was determined by the amount of work the British required to earn it. For example, if the British gave workers 1 coin for 1 day of work, the coin would be worth 1 day of work.
So what does that mean? Assuming the only way to get script from the British is to grow coffee, some people would have to get script through other means. For example, if a chef wanted to get script, he'd have to get script from someone else who would be willing to work for the British growing coffee by selling him food in exchange for the extra money that the person earned for growing coffee. So how did these two people determine a price? They come to a mutual agreement about the price, which today we call market forces. Prices where buyers and sellers come together. In this case, the price would be based on how hard one has to work to get the script from the British.
However, if the British started paying 2 coins for each day of work, the coin would then be worth half as much.
If you recall, the food that the chef was exchanging was originally worth a day's work. Since you can now earn 2 coins for a day's work, the price of the same amount of food would go up to 2 coins.
The same is true in the US today. Whether the government knows it or not, the value of the dollar is based on the prices the government pays when it spends.
Lesson 4. Unemployment. Under the British, there was no unemployment in Ghana. The British imposed a tax that created unemployment, but then it hired those people to work in the coffee fields. What if the tax caused more people wanting to work than the British wanted to hire? No problem. The British could either hire them or reduce the hut tax, which reduced the amount of time that people needed to work for the British. And the same is true today. U.S. tax liabilities create unemployment, which allows the government to hire the people it needs in exchange for the U.S. dollar. Therefore, today's unemployment is the evidence that the government's tax liabilities created more unemployed than the government has hired. The resolution is obvious. The government can either hire the people that it made unemployed, or they can lower the tax, so these people can go back to the private sector where they came from. However, there's one additional consideration. Private sector businesses don't like to hire people who are unemployed. They prefer to hire people already working. To promote the transition from unemployment to private sector employment, the government can offer a transition job to anybody willing and able to work. This has become popularized as the job guarantee.